there's a high degree of consensus that there needs to be a very robust response by the West to Putin's aggression in Ukraine.
So elections in Poland, then, they'll be at some point this autumn, and a familiar name is leading the opposition party.
That's right, Donald Tusk, who was the president of the European Council and was previously prime minister in Poland from 2007 to 2014. He's the leader of Civic platform, so that's the main opposition party. It's a sort of liberal centrist grouping, and it's currently running second in the polls at just under 30%.
So how popular are Law and Justice by comparison, or rather, how durable is their popularity? Because they are, some of the great survivors of the past sort of decade or more in European politics.
Yeah, so at the moment they're running ahead in the polls. They're running at around about 36%. But that wouldn't be enough to get them a majority in Parliament. They've had a majority since 2015. They got re-elected with a majority in 2019, which means that if there was an election held today, there's a very good chance that they would lose office, and that some kind of combination of the opposition parties, Civic platform, and a mix of kind of more left-wing parties, other sort of liberal centrist parties, an agrarian party would come to office. But the election is not going to be held today. It's going to be held in the autumn, and a lot can happen between now and the autumn. And in particular, if the Law and Justice can come through the winter in kind of reasonably good shape, if there isn't a sort of major energy crisis, which there hasn't been up until now, although people were afraid there would be, if inflation starts to go down, if unemployment remains fairly low, if the economy, which is shrinking, doesn't actually go into recession, and if it can start, for example, tapping into the EU coronavirus funds, which have been frozen at the moment, but it's hoping is going to be unlocked by the spring, well, then there's everything to play for. I mean, a lot of voters at the moment are not switching from Law and Justice to the opposition. A lot of previous Law and Justice voters are abstaining. They're saying they're not going to vote, and that really accounts for the fluctuations in the polls. So at the moment, 36% puts them in the lead, but wouldn't be enough to win. But if they can win back some of those voters who at the moment are planning to abstain rather than switch to the opposition and get up nearer to about 40%, then there's still a chance, and every chance, I would say, that they could actually win again in the autumn. So all to play for, I would say.
Poland, obviously, as well, right on the frontier of the Ukraine conflict. It's been dealing with about 1.4 million Ukrainian refugees crossing the border. How does this all play into the domestic political situation? Is there a degree of cross-party consensus, or is this a potential flashpoint?
There is. And actually, I mean, the number you cite, it's actually much, much higher than that, the number of refugees who've passed through Poland. I mean, we're talking about, 4, 5, 6 million. You're talking about the number who've actually settled there and staying there. So I think there is, as you say, a very high level of consensus over this. I mean, it's a strange issue because if you watch the Polish news, which for my sins I do every night, it's one of the lead items is the war, but it's not one that's really kind of dividing political parties very much. There's a high degree of consensus that there needs to be a very robust response by the West to Putin's aggression in Ukraine. I mean, the parties, insofar as they do compete, they kind of compete with each other on who's providing the most solidarity with Ukraine. There's a very high level of consensus in support of receiving refugees from Ukraine in Poland. There's a few concerns about issues like the kind of benefits that they're receiving and whether more Ukrainians should be working rather than receiving benefits. But it's not an issue around which anybody can really mobilize. There's a lot of support and solidarity. I think the one difference is that, I mean, one of the things that Law and Justice has done is that it's kind of broken with the kind of the major EU powers and particularly with Germany in terms of its approach to EU policy. And if there was to be a change of government, well, I mean, the main EU powers, Franco-German axis, if you like, are much more inclined to try and reach some kind of agreement that would end the war much, much more quickly and possibly not on as favourable terms to Ukraine. So arguably, they would be more kind of susceptible to to being influenced in that way. But I think what the opposition would argue is that because they're closer to the Franco-German axis, they could perhaps influence them more and get them to take a tougher line. So I think that's the only real difference. So it's a funny issue because it's ubiquitous in Poland. They talk about it all the time. As obviously it's a kind of frontline state with, as you say, millions of Ukrainians refugees moving in. But it's also it's not an issue in the sense that it's not something that the parties really argue about, because there is a high degree of consensus about this, except occasionally about which is the one that can would most effectively defend Poland if there was a conflict, and who's providing the best solidarity with Ukraine.
And many listeners will remember Donald Tusk, the opposition leader, for his role in the Brexit brouhaha. He was president of the European Council, of course. The interesting question as regards Poland and the EU, though, is Poland has sort of become one of the black sheep of the EU on the eastern border, with its sort of the government sort of tweaking the terms of the judiciary, also its stances on LGBTQ plus and abortion rights. Will this be a sort of, is this a big dividing line in Polish civic society and political society? Is it a sort of the Eurosceptic right versus the, well, if not quite the liberal left, but sort of the the much more pluralist sort of Europhile left, who are more in favour of EU integration and not antagonising the European Commission, say?
Yeah, I think there's two things to separate out here. I mean, first of all, there's absolutely no support in terms of public opinion or indeed in terms of the political elites for Poland leaving the EU. I mean, it's something like 4 or 5%, of people would support Polexit, and there's no major political party, even the most Eurosceptic political parties to the right of Law and Justice. There is a party like that called the Confederation, which is in Parliament, doesn't explicitly call for Poland to leave the EU. But there is a very sharp debate about, the kind of EU that Poland should be a member of, and the way that Poland should exercise its influence within the EU. And as you say, Poland does very much stand outside what you might call the kind of the liberal left consensus on sort of moral cultural issues, things like abortion or sexual attitudes towards sexual minorities, or indeed things like multiculturalism. And the Law and Justice government argues that one of the reasons that it's in conflict with the EU political establishment is because it's kind of picking on it, because it does stand outside that consensus on those issues. Its argument is that a lot of the reforms that it's introducing in terms of things like the judiciary actually are in line with arrangements that exist in other Western European democracies. Whereas the opposition, as you say, is very much more in favour of locating Poland within that kind of European mainstream, if you like. And this also maps onto approaches to how the European integration project should develop. I mean, Poland is very much Law and Justice is very much in favour of a kind of an intergovernmentalist Europe of nations, if you like, approach, conceding as little sovereignty as possible to supranational institutions and trying to make the nation state the core, if you like, of the European integration project, whereas the opposition is much more inclined to go along with sort of federal integrationist policies. That, I think, there is a very clear difference as far as that's concerned. And you would notice a very big difference if the opposition was to take power. I mean, they would very much try and get Poland back, if you like, within what's referred to as sometimes as the European mainstream, which basically means building much closer links with the main EU powers, with Franco-German access, and Berlin in particular.
Well,